Well, we now have joining me Dr. Kari. She is a global affairs expert and will be talking about this U.S. strike in Nigeria as, so to speak, a coordinated attack against the ISIS. Now, let's delve straight into it. Looking at it from a sovereignty point of view, do you believe that the U.S. airstrikes impacts Nigeria's sovereignty, even though it worked with the Nigerian government to carry out the strikes?
Well, if the question is what I believe, I would need a lot more information to make an assessment. We don't really know what happened behind the scenes. And news outlets like Reuters are reporting that there was cooperation and there was reconnaissance already done in November. If that is indeed the case and Nigeria did cooperate fully and proactively, there's no question about whether Nigeria's sovereignty was harmed or will be harmed in the future. However, it may be the case that although politically and theoretically Nigeria could have said no to these strikes, if they could practically have stopped the strikes is another question. And the current government is now reframing this as a cooperation. We won't know, though, unless internal documents are provided.
Right. Let's talk about the long-term effectiveness of this. I mean, you're a political scientist and you're a global affairs expert, and to look at this point of view from a more holistic angle would, go a long way. So, can airstrikes alone effectively address the root causes of terrorism in any country, or is there more a comprehensive solution that's needed to tackle this?
Yeah, airstrikes alone won't be able to prevent a terrorist problem. There's no historical evidence that airstrikes have stopped terrorism. There have been airstrikes done as counterterrorism efforts for decades, but they haven't been shown to address the root cause of terrorism. And they'll have a very minimal effect on the long-term effects of things like recruitment, and they could even fuel anti-American sentiment and more radicalism. In Nigeria, as in other places, more comprehensive solutions are needed for comprehensive problems. It's driven by a mix of issues, and it's something that can actually worsen if civilians are harmed and communities are targeted by these airstrikes.
So let's look at the regional implications as well. Do you think the airstrikes will affect regional security dynamics in West Africa, particularly regarding ISIS affiliates?
It depends on what kind of regional position Nigeria wants to take. By targeting terrorists within its borders, it's going to be pushing them into border regions. And high-profile strikes by the U.S. can actually go both ways. They can negatively affect local terrorist cells, but they can also be used for propaganda, prestige, and retaliation. So there might be a short-term disruption of terrorist activity in northern Nigeria where the strikes took place, but it might actually encourage cross-border attacks or push these pockets to Nigeria's neighbors.
Right. Now, we'll talk about humanitarian concerns and civilian casualties, like you said. There should be measures in place to prevent civilian casualties and address potential humanitarian crises resulting from the airstrikes, right?
Well, that's true. And an indication of how integrated Nigeria was in the planning. I know there's some structural weaknesses within Nigeria that might prevent measures that could protect civilians from cooperation like this in the future. But let's be honest, if this was a short-term decision by the United States or Nigeria wasn't proactively involved, it would have been hard to warn civilians. And this could have a real negative effect on the current government. The current reporting says that there were no civilian casualties, but we have to keep in mind when you're cooperating with the United States, in light of how they've reacted to situations like in Venezuela, how they define terrorists, could actually be very detrimental for Nigeria. Civilians, journalists, and opposition groups can also become targets eventually if they're allowed just to strike within your country.
And now that brings me to the next question, talking about terrorism narrative. How does the U.S. framing of the airstrikes as a response to Christian genocide impact the narrative of the conflict in Nigeria, and what are the potential consequences of that?
Well, there's two answers to that. It's very beneficial for the United States and very detrimental for Nigeria, how that was framed. There's over 45% of Nigeria is Christian. In the United States, it's about 63%. But 78% of Trump voters are Christian. And by framing this as protecting Christians, what that does is it gives Trump's voting base a relatable group, and it makes Trump into a hero figure for them. And this is very beneficial for him. And for Nigeria, it's exactly the opposite. It oversimplifies qualifications and it makes it into a Muslims against Christian situation, which is, of course, not true because there's also been Muslim victims of this violence. And this oversimplification can cause huge problems within society. And I would recommend that if you're watching how these events are covered, watch for the event from where the strikes happened to why they happened, because there is a disconnect with where the strikes happened and where most of the persecution against Christians has happened in Nigeria.
And now let's look at the security cooperation now as a final conversation. Now, what are the implications of Nigeria's cooperation with the United States on security matters, and how might this affect its relationship with other international partners? There's Russia, there's China there. Plus, how might the airstrikes influence Nigerian domestic politics, particularly in the context of the elections that will be coming up just a year or plus after?
Well, let's start with your last question first. If we're looking at the benefit for the ruling party right now, for Tinubu's administration and his party, cooperation on something like this should have happened closer to the election. People don't have, as research shows, a very long memory when it comes to positives. Fighting terrorism, though, is a long-term issue. Like I indicated, that airstrikes alone simply won't get the job done. So you have to then consider what steps will be taken from now until the election if there's real results for it to benefit the current administration in Nigeria. Going back to how this could help or hurt Nigeria internationally or in the larger scheme of things, the bottom line here is Nigeria could really gain capability, but it is going to be trading some strategic autonomy if it does decide to partner with the United States and continue to cooperate with them with these airstrikes. There's an opportunity for Nigeria because as the West is getting pushed out of the Sahel region, Nigeria then offers a new location for these Western countries to be based for intelligence sharing, surveillance, and being used as a selective strike base. And this will help with the security in general of Nigeria. But of course, there's the sovereignty optics, which is a domestic risk. And Nigeria will then be faced with a choice if they have to choose Russia, China, or the United States, which is something that many countries in Africa are facing right now.
Right. Thank you so much, Kari Alderman, for joining us on Arise America. She's a global affairs expert to touch on the U.S.'s strike. And yeah, that's it.